Good afternoon, Airshow attendees. We're not doing passengers today because, as you can see, we have a lovely little single-seater plane to be flying about in instead of the usual 10-seater. So, today we'll be flying this Airshow replica of a Fokker DR1 or DRI in some people's renditions. Triplane from 1917, one of the more famous aircraft from World War I. It is of course a German aircraft, but we've got it here painted up in my own custom livery, which is based on the Stop with Camels flown by the 4th Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps. So this is essentially the paint job the paint job of a lot of the Stop with Camels that would have been trying to take these triplanes out of the sky. So, you know, in theory it's possibly a captured plane, possibly something else along those lines. Maybe it's a post-war trophy. It's never really that defined, but we've got it here as a fictional livery because I didn't feel like flying around in German markings. The absolutely most common paint job that you will find for these is bright red, because of one guy who flew them for a little bit. You've probably heard of him. Which, fun fact, probably taken out of the sky in a Fokker triplane by an Australian, or several Australians. It's probably taken down by ground fire, and he was flying over some Australian artillery units at the time. I mean, theoretically anti-aircraft batteries, but it was 1917, that was less formal than it is now. And one of the most distinctive things about the Australian Flying Corps is they had these big red stripes with a kangaroo on. And yes, they even did the, quite modern art thing of having the tail of the kangaroo just sticking off the side of the stripe there. Makes it look a bit more dynamic. Lets you put a bigger kangaroo and only have that little stripe going in off the side of it, which I think looks quite snazzy. And those of you who know World War I plane markings might realise that this is otherwise very standard British. So the Australian Flying Corps was essentially part of the Royal Flying Corps at the time. So number 1 Squadron AFC was actually also called number 67 Squadron RFC, or number 67 Australian Squadron RFC. Number 2 was number 68, number 3 was number 69, and number 4, which is the most successful Australian fighter squadron of the war, which is what this is based on, was number 71. So I'm not actually sure what happened with number 70 Squadron. I guess they were just normal RFC. So the flight sim model for this itself is from a group called Got Friends, who are also the group responsible for the Man's Best Friend avatar mod, which is how we have Wing Commander Lamington with us. Not for this flight, because as you can see, it is a single-seater and not fit for dogs. And we've got Australian modern registration number there, but actually placed where designed such that it matches how the World War I planes would have it for British service. And, a bit of text there, nicely handwritten as it would have been, of just marking their trophy. So I'll just go over the anatomy of the planes first, just because it's a fascinating machine, let's call it. So, we've got lovely tailplane here that is in fact a flat board. It is absolutely just a flat board with a flat board on the back of it for pointing up and down. And the tail fin is entirely rudder, which is delightful. We can see there that it moves all the way through the entire thing, because I mean they sometimes had tail and rudder, sometimes they just make the entire thing move, make it control a little better. And the braking system on this, so modern planes have wheel brakes, and they will especially have left and right wheel brakes, just so that you can actually steer it when you're on the ground. The originals of these would have none of that. So you can see the wheel chocks there, which are the entire parking brake system. And one misconception that you get is that chocks away is when you're starting up the plane. No, chocks away is when you're starting to move the plane off, because it's the thing stopping you going forwards. And the only other brake is in fact down here. That's skid. The tail skid, which was also on essentially big rubber bands, is your, it gives some friction, and that gives you braking. So if you need to make the plane go slower on the ground, you pull up on the elevator, and if you're moving forward, that will push the tail skid more into the ground, so you will stop a bit better. And the only other braking system is seen just here. Can you see the other brake? Well, unfortunately, half of the brake is not actually present, because it would be somebody standing on the ground holding on to the base of this strut here. Your braking system is a guy on each wing holding it back. There are some fabulous illustrations in the 1918 flying manual that I've been reading for preparation for this stream. And yeah, the way you hold the plane still when starting up the engine, if you don't have the chocks or you don't have anything else to secure it with, is a guy on each wing holding it. It also includes demonstration of how to place your back such that you can put yourself under the wing to help lift the plane. Because yeah, this machine is let me just check my figures here. I have so many notes for this stream, it's mad. About 450 kilos. I have the number somewhere specific in these notes and it is not popping out to me, but yes, this plane is about 400 and something kilos when empty. About 150 of that is just engine, because the engine is rather large. And also there's basically no ground steering on one of these. So modern planes, you will have, if it's a tail dragger like this, then it will be able to do different braking on each wheel such that it turns around the wheel that stops. And usually if it's got a tail wheel, you can turn the wheel. This thing has a skid. You can't turn the skid. Like, the stuff rigged into the controls that would turn the tail skid, no, that's just wabbling the rudder. So the way that you maneuver these on the ground is, you see we've got these other two things sticking off the bottom of the plane here. I'm just going to squat down so that we can see these. Get a bit of a closer view of my nice texturing work, because the Australian Flying Corps livery that we've got here is my work over about a month trying to research and design it. So we've got these two things sticking off the bottom of the plane. This one here is a footstep. This is how you get in, because you don't want to be putting your feet on these lovely fabric wings, and it's not like it's got much of a door. You just have to step on there, step into the cockpit. That's how you get in. This other thing down here looks kind of similar. And yes, like a stirrup, this plane has inbuilt stirrups. And given that it was basically taking over the role that used to be the cavalry in the scouting and harassment senses, it's kind of appropriate that it has stirrups. Yeah, so you see here there is a little curved handle. That is the other part of your ground maneuvering system, along with the two guys on the wing spars to hold it back. You'd have two guys on these handles to lift, and then they pick, not just a guy, four just guys, and then they lift it up. They can, and because most of the weight will be on the wheels, like that's the point. You want most of the weight to be close to the wings, and the wings are where the wheels are. So, it's actually relatively balanced. So, when it starts going forward, the tail comes up pretty quickly from, 20, 30 knot headwind once you're moving. So, it's not too heavy to lift up the back, and then it's just on two wheels. You can port it around fairly easily. And then that's how you get around the aerodrome. Now, I don't have Flight Sim simulating a bunch of stout lads to help me move my plane. So this one I have gone in and done some modifications so that it has mild wheel brakes and a couple of other things to aid in ground handling, just because it's an Airshow replica. It's not a World War I original, so it's not made exactly to those specs. And yes, I have also made the nose cone, the engine cowling nice and shiny, and put kangaroos on it because I can. And the paint job on the wheels matches the underside of the wings, which are a lighter colour than on the top side. This is a thing that I like to do because anyone looking at your plane from above will see something a bit more the fields of eastern France and western Germany and the shattered remains of Belgium. And anybody looking up will see something a bit lighter, a bit more sky-like. You can't do utterly perfectly camouflaged because you keep rolling this thing around and being looked at from different angles. Aerial camouflage is a whole topic, and one that, and yes, sharks have that. It is called counter shading. Lots of animals will have dark back, light belly, because that also gives you the when you get hit by shadows, like the underside of the wings do not actually look as pale as they are, and the tops do not look as dark as they are if you look at these bits that are actually in the sun here. And another feature that delights me is these little wooden skids, because this thing loves to roll, and it loves to roll when you are trying to do things on the ground. So it is just easier to put a disposable bit of wood there on a metal bracket and let that take the impact and replace it after the flight. And there is in fact another quarter of a wing in this three-winged beast, and this tiny little wing will hold, basically counteracts the effects of the landing gear. So it's 3.2 wings, which I find just delightful. We just stuck an extra little wing on there. It'll fit. And as I was talking about on a previous pie wing. Oh yes, I think that would actually count for... I'm not going to get distracted by trying to do the maths on how much of a wing and whether this is in fact a pie-winged plane. But that delights me. And here we have that rotary engine that I was talking about. So this is a 9-cylinder radial rotary engine. It is absolutely massive displacement. I think 900 and something cubic inches, 14-ish litres. It's a big engine. And yet it produces 110 horsepower, which is okay for a medium-sized car. The engine technology had not actually progressed as far as people like to think by 1917. And this engine, or the French one that it was based on, because this is essentially a rip-off design made by the Germans, was in a lot of planes. Like, you would get a lot of dogfights where the German version would be on most of the planes on one side, and the French version would be on most of the planes on the other. So they're all just like, same engine, we'll compete on airframe design and pilot skill. And there is one ridiculous little engineering feature that I want to point out that I added into the decoration of this plane. If we get down on the ground underneath, you can see this line of... is that stitching? And yes, that is essentially stitching. So these are fabric-covered chrome molybdenum steel frames, and there is a whole bunch of wires down the entire body structure here. There are bracing wires that reinforce the structure, and there are control wires going to all of the flappy bits at the back. And you need to be able to get to those to do any maintenance on the plane. Like, for almost every flight, you have to check the tension on your bracing wires, you have to check the tension on your control cables, you have to fine-tune everything, you have to check for rust. And if you just covered the entire thing in canvas cover, which is also, then covered in a compound called dope, which is waterproofing and stiffening, you can't exactly unbolt a panel. So what the Germans would do, and you'll see this on all of the modern replicas of these, but what the Germans would do on these fabric-covered fuselages is just big row of basically just stitches down the entire underside of the plane, and when you need to get in there for maintenance, you undo the stitches and then you do them up again afterwards. So that was a fun little one to add while I was designing this livery. Now we get back up off the ground, and we've got nice varnished and painted end caps, and you can also see where the curved plywood reinforced front edge ends, and the fabric covering starts, which, I'm quite happy with that little detail. Imagining some poor tech with a seam ripper as big as their arm. Like, I was also picturing that. I have to assume that they would just, do it with knots every so often and make it so you can unlace it rather than seam rip the entire thing, because you're going to go through a lot of cord doing that, which seems a little ridiculous to me. But who knows, maybe they were just ridiculous. So, I think that is most of the external tour of the plane. There will be more info dumping about many things to come. And if we just hop inside, here we have the inside of the plane. Now, one of the things I've been doing is actually redesigning a whole bunch of these instruments just to make them a bit more to my standards, making them be in German. So, you know, we've got the proper German word for fuel, and it now says litres instead of E and F. In hundreds of hoher in Fuß, height in feet. And the fun thing is this little compass here, which is not actually how the compass would be on one of these, but this compass design is based on something held at the Australian War Memorial, because it turns out that with that being captured by an Australian, being shot down by an Australian artillery unit, is he kind of crashed on top of Australian positions. So there's a few Red Baron artifacts in the Australian War Memorial, and this is the design of compass that he had in his Fokker triplane. They have it modelled here as a pocket compass just bolted in, which is adorable, I must say, but it was actually a gimbal mounted proper navigational compass, thus the design that it's got on it, but it at least has the proper compass face on it, which I had a lot of fun designing. Or, well, copying the design from pictures on the museum website into my format. Which, it's actually a fairly nicely designed little cockpit, not a direct replica of a Fokker DR1 triplane, because that's a complicated subject. But it's ridiculously simple. You might notice that some of the standard instruments are not there. So, left to right, we've got a airspeed gauge in tens of knots. We've got an engine tachometer in hundreds of revolutions per minute. Down at the bottom we've got a clock in clock numbers. I've got an altimeter in hundreds, thousands and tens of thousands of feet. The tens of thousands is an ambitious thing to be putting on a plane like this, but you know, it's good to have that if you somehow aren't sure if you're 2,000 or 12,000 feet above the ground while completely outside. The pilot comforts are a basic leather bucket seat, and did I mention the seat? That's the pilot comforts. You would sometimes have a little windscreen to sit between you and the engine, because, as I mentioned on the previous rant about rotary engines, they are a total loss oiling system, which is, actually just to hop outside for a moment, if you look at the cowling here, which is the big silver cover over the engine, you'll notice that the top is entirely enclosed. That's so that the oil flung out of these cylinders can go out the bottom, but it won't go out the top as much, which keeps the pilot slightly less blinded by getting hit by castor oil at whatever temperature it's coming out at. And the adorable little eyes, which at least one German ace did paint eyebrows over these little air vents. Those are just for more ventilation, as is the bottom opening here. The way that you do cooling on these engines is that it's spinning in the airstream. It'll blow itself cooler, one of the two. And of course, fixed blade propeller that is essentially a paddle. propeller technology was in its infancy. It doesn't have a variable pitch, doesn't have the most efficient profile, but it gets the plane going. And of course I made sure to have I mean, this is a World War II pilot model, but better than my usual nice piloting business shirt for this sort of work. And yes, the rest of the environmental controls for a pilot you can see here are a leather jacket, a leather cap, goggles. You must have the goggles between the air coming in and hitting you in the face at 100 knots and any bugs that are in the air that hitting you at 100 knots and the fumes off the engine and the hot castor oil off the engine. Wear your goggles. And, you know, gloves, fur-lined boots. Make yourself cozy. Doesn't matter, like, one of my big references from this has been a book called Practical Flying. It's got a longer title, which is, you know, books of that era always do. Is a 1918 book on flying instruction. And one of the things it says is it does not matter how hot it is, wear your full flying kit, you will not notice the heat after 30 seconds of flying. And it also says to always carry money, because if you get into trouble and have to land somewhere random, which one, you could do a lot more in these than in modern planes. You know, this will just land in a field, and they had more fields back then. Like, it's money to hire a farm labourer to guard your plane for you, or hire a local car mechanic, which those were also fairly new, possibly a blacksmith, to fix whatever's gone wrong on your plane. It's all very adventurous. Kind of aimed at the halfway between the civil and military market. It was in the early part of 1918, so still during the war. And the controls. So down at the feet, we've got the rudder tiller, which is just directly connected by 2 wires to the rudder. We've got the yoke, which is a nice direct 2 sets of cable controls. A little bit stiff there, need to double check that. And then 3 engine controls. So over on the right we have a fuel cutoff, just in case. On the left we've got the fuel mixture, nice and accessible there. And then there's the throttle lever. That's up here. They want you to keep both hands on the controls. So it's just on the yoke. It's great. And then L and R, luckily the German and English words for left and right start with the same letters, so that's still readable. Now on this, they have this center button between the 2 triggers hooked up as the press both triggers at once button. On the actual plane, that was an engine control. It's called the blip switch. So these engines don't actually idle low enough to count really for idling. So you hit the blip switch to just momentarily turn the engine off. Which is slightly cursed. Richthofen had his, literally taken out, and there's just a hole in between the 2 triggers, and then he's just got it mounted up on the right, basically where his right thumb would be sitting while he's flying, because he wanted quicker access to that, which I think is delightful. We've just got button that turns the engine off a bit, because these things are not designed to taxi on this nice paved surface. This is weird for a World War I airfield. You would be on grass. So everything is designed on the assumption that you are on grass. And of course, being a World War I plane, we have the two 7.92mm Spandau machine guns. In this plane, those are designed only to fire blanks, because that is the way I choose to represent myself. But it does let you do some good drama for an air show, which we will be doing an air show. I will actually be taking the plane off, not just ranting about the inside. So I think we're getting to the point where I want to actually take this plane off. But last thing I will note is these weird semicircular cutouts in the middle wing. And the reason for that is you might notice I can't see anything forward. If I really hoik myself up and basically sit on the back of the seat, you can kind of see forward. But otherwise, you can kind of look over one side of the nose, and you can peek under it. And that is how you see anything in front of you-ish on the ground. And that problem would continue all the way to modern any tail draggers, because when the nose is pointing up in the air, you can't see over it very well. So, let's actually get this engine started. And it has a checklist. Haha. Fokker 3 checklist. I have had to modify this checklist because the original one had you remove the wheel chocks before starting the engine. That is a bad idea. Okay, flight plan is briefed. Wheel chocks are secure. Yes, I can see them over the edge there. Master battery on. Fuel levels checked. Might actually just quietly get somebody to come in and pour some more fuel into that. Glip, 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 glip. I mean, not as bad an idea if you got the 4 just guys holding you down. I think they'd like the extra assistance. There we go. Fuel tank has been refilled, and it is a quite small fuel tank by modern standards, which is why I'm making sure to take off with it absolutely full. But there is the pre-flight checks. Alternator on, master battery on, fuel shutoff is in, mixture to full rich. I love that you can see the cable that lever is connected to. And a throttle cracked open. And I do not need this for the next little bit. And now we shout clear! And we move the mags to start. Lovely. And once that's stable and started, we ease back on the engine, and it starts to sound very grumpy with us, which is utterly inevitable. Okay, and we will do our control checks, which control checks are a lot easier in this plane because you can look over here and check that your ailerons are moving freely. And we look over here and we check the other aileron. And then we look behind us. There's our elevators moving freely. And there's the rudder moving freely. So, that is our full set of control checks. So, the first thing will be getting us into the air, which luckily Temora has a lovely little gravel strip that will be better for this. And, so working through practical flying, one thing to note is that the language was very much still in development. So they always, instead of saying taking off, they will say getting off, which is deeply amusing to my teenage side. And they have some lovely little bits of advice, like, it is desirable to get underway gradually. This saves the machine, which should at all times be treated as a fragile and very sensitive piece of mechanism. The early days of flight were fascinating for just being ridiculous. And they always refer to the machine, not the plane, in this book. It's great. So, chocks away. And we've just got the added ground brakes for this modified plane, replacing our 4 Just Guys. Temora traffic. Martel, Baron Skippy taxiing to runway 27 for aerobatic displays. And we begin our taxiing. Which, being very careful, have to overcome the... There we go. And not hitting that. But we have to overcome the ground friction from that skid, which is quite good. And this thing is a nightmare to maneuver on the ground. And it's also a nightmare to take off with. Because we have to be able to get our aircraft lined up with the runway. And then hit off those controls. Okay, and here we are on the runway. Temora traffic. Baron Skippy taking off from runway 27 and remaining in the area for aerobatic displays. Okay, and yes, this plane is fascinating to try to pilot. And the first thing that you'll see is gyroscopic effects from this ridiculous engine. So we advance the throttle gently, even though it massively increases our takeoff roll, because we have 150 kilos of spinning metal plus the propeller. So the gyroscopic forces on the plane, if you're familiar at all with the gyroscopic precession, once I get the engine spinning, if I pull up, it tries to roll. If I push down, it rolls the other way. Which is... and yes, hence the roll skids. That is one of the major times when you need these. But now we are in the air and flying along nicely at about 75 knots. And just working to get some altitude. So the way that the rotary engine will give you gyroscopic precession effects is actually something that was used in the maneuvering for these planes. Certain planes would get it more or less, like the Sopwith Camel, the most famous of the British planes of the war, was notable for getting it particularly heavily. And essentially, they will roll a lot better one way than the other, and if you force them into a dive, they will roll. So, if you know where the plane you're chasing is going to move, you can chase them down better. So, because we've got this big engine that is spinning to the right, this thing will roll to the right quite briskly. It does not enjoy that maneuver, but it will do it quite well, and lose some height doing it. And then if it tries to roll to the left, it is, it's still a ridiculously maneuverable plane, but it's slightly slower. And also, if you are trying to pull up in a turn, it will try to keep rolling to the right, and if you are pulling up in the other direction, it will try to stall because you did that maneuver just slightly wrong. That's not quite what I was meaning to demonstrate there, but it is one of the things that will be demonstrated repeatedly over the course of today. But if we are in a nice stable bank and try to pull up, it doesn't try to keep rolling into it because the force of that is balanced out. Now I will be aiming to keep over Temora Airport just for all of the demonstrations of things, because if we're doing an air show, that's presumably where the people who've paid the tickets to see the planes are. And I will be aiming to start from about 2,500 feet, just so that we don't have any ground-based incidents. Now, a fascinating instruction that comes for almost all of the manoeuvres in practical flying of 1918 is that the first thing you do is check that the belts holding you into the plane are well attached. And yes, no emergency litho braking, only the regular litho braking in a controlled manner at the end of the flight. Now, the first thing listed in the more advanced maneuvers, or more advanced flying, that I will not be demonstrating the first maneuver from this, because the first more advanced thing is an ascent of 10,000 feet. And that doesn't sound like it should be an advanced flying thing. We do that regularly in the Cessna Caravan, and it's barely noticeable. In the Cessna Caravan, we are in a warm glass and aluminium box that is very safe. In the Fokker Triplane, we are sitting on a lawn chair inside a open canvas and metal tub. The only thing between us and a plummet is a seatbelt. So, the description for the ascent of 10,000 feet. There is nothing difficult or dangerous in such a climb. It merely requires patience and a certain amount of nerve to carry it through for the first time. And yes, patience. So, the Fokker Triplane was described as climbing like a monkey by Baron von Richthofen. It will do over 1,000 feet per minute climb, which to a modern eye is almost nothing. The Caravan will do 1,800. The Caribou, carrying 3 tons of cargo, will do 1,300. this thing at peak aerobatic performance will do maybe 1100 feet per minute. This thing is, I'm going to say primitive, because so this plane, the first Fokker Triplane, entered service July 1917. The Wright Flyer had its first flight December 1903. 13 and a half years between the Wright brothers' first flight and this thing, which is rapid progress, but also this thing is kind of primitive. But also very pretty. So, aerobatic maneuvers. The first one that's listed is called the Zoom, which is, I am flying along at about my maximum speed, and I decide I do not like being at 2,500 feet, I would like to be at some more. So we pull back, we don't stall, and we are now at 2,800 feet. Very useful maneuver, but it shows up in more advanced flying with the aerobatic maneuvers. And of course, and yes, the article of humanity is at least 100 years from flight, like a week before, or a day before, yeah. So, there is our first aerobatic maneuver, which barely counts to a modern eye, the Zoom. And there is also the nosedive. So, as we are flying along back over the airfield, and we decide, I do not like being at 2,900 feet. We cut the engine, we put the nose down, we put the nose up, and we restore the engine. And oh look, we're back at 2,500 feet. So yes, the Zoom and the nosedive. Those are some of the first introductory complicated maneuvers. They're not just straight sensible flying. And a lot of maneuvers in this plane describe just cut the engine. It will come back on as you're going. Now, a song that I have had stuck in my head all week is Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines, which I have been torn over whether I would be singing it or not, but I've decided not to. Nobody deserves that. But the first maneuver described in that song is they go up diddly up up, they go down diddly down down. So, the Zoom is up diddly up up. You are sad that I'm not singing. And we have the nosedive, the down diddly down down. I will consider singing later. Now the next aerobatic maneuver that they describe, which is an interesting and a classic, is the loop. Or, as in the song, looping the loop and defying the ground. Now, this plane struggles to do a loop because it has a 110 horsepower engine that weighs a lot. So you actually need to go to full engine and a dive, get about 110 knots, and we pull back, and we cut the engine, And we bring the engine back. So, in more modern planes, even World War II aircraft, you can just kind of do a loop, and it's fine. This thing struggles. Because, like, it climbs at, you know, maybe 1,000 feet per minute if you're doing well. And doing a loop involves going vertical. Is the engine designed to start and stop like that? Kind of. Like, they have the blip switch for just cutting it out. And it's not fully stopping, it's just going to 0 power and windmill effect, aka just the wind hitting the propeller keeps the engine turning over. So it's not like it's actually cutting out. It's actually hard to stop the engine of this fully in the air. So yes, doing a loop. Now for this one, to test the alignment, so we are lined up along the course of the north-south runway. And we get our 110 knots. And we pull back. And we stall. And we see that it's trying to twist us. We cut the engine. And we come back up. So we actually turned about 45 degrees to the left there. Because when we stalled at the top of the loop, the plane did not actually just carry around in its loop. Which gets us to the next thing, which is a maneuver that I sometimes achieve properly and sometimes don't. So one of the first German flying aces was called Max Immelmann. And there is a thing called an Immelmann turn, named after him. And the modern Immelmann turn absolutely cannot be done in any plane ever seen by Max Immelmann. Because the modern Immelmann turn is a half loop at the top of which you roll over and just keep flying. It lets you do a U-turn in the sky very quickly, but like this thing, if I am very careful, can do that kind of Immelmann badly. The Fokker Dr, which is the single wing warping based, so no ailerons thing that started air-to-air combat, cannot do that. If its engine could, its wings would rip off. But there's this maneuver named the Immelmann that is turning around quickly. So it turns out that the Immelmann, say that 5 to 10 times fast, is a different way of doing a U-turn while using the vertical. It's probably the thing that's now called a wing over. So, we're flying along. We decide we want to be facing backwards instead. We get to about 110 knots. We pull up. And we hit the rudder to one side. And if we are very careful like that, we lose almost no altitude in the maneuver apart from the dive, and we are now facing 180 degrees behind us, which, keeping an eye on the north-south runway, I actually managed that time. I have been practicing that maneuver in particular quite a lot this week. So, the Immelmann, as probably performed by Immelmann. So one of the reasons it's named after him is that he wrote a manual of combat flying. because he was one of the first to be particularly good at it. He did not survive being good at it, I'm pretty sure, but that's the way it is. There are like 4 different maneuvers theorized as the World War I Immelmann, but the wingover is the only one that I've actually been able to make work in this plane. And again, we dive, we get speed, pull up at about 2300, hit the rudder, make sure we don't roll too far, and pull up. And we dropped about 50 feet total in that maneuver, which is one of the better ones I've ever done. I usually lose about 100 feet in that. The times where you don't get it quite right, you will either do a 270 degree turn or lose 500 feet of altitude, or both. Which is part of why I am starting these at about 2500 as a goal. Now, there is a maneuver related to the modern Immelmann, which is called a split S. And the Fokker Triplane is one of the few World War I aircraft that I think would actually be able to do it, because this thing is noted for its dive performance. So what a split S is that it is essentially that half loop and then roll out of it that is the modern Immelmann, but you just do those steps backwards. And this one does cost you 500 to 600 feet. About 600. Because instead of roll out of a half loop and then... instead of do a half loop and then roll out of it, we cut the engine, roll into the half loop, and then do the half loop. And then re-engage the engine. And we've turned around reasonably to that 180 degree line. It is a ridiculous maneuver, and we lost, as expected, about 600 feet. Now, I am working the engine of this fairly hard for display purposes. One of the things that is recommended for longer flights is that every so often, and this is a recommendation from Practical Flying, every so often you just cut the engine down to 0, let the plane glide until you've lost about 1,000 feet of altitude, then start the engine up again. Just lets it cool off a little. Utterly ridiculous by modern standards. But yeah, so there is the Split S and the World War I Immelmann, which are nothing alike, where the modern Immelmann and the Split S are basically backwards of each other. And just again, because I am enjoying actually being able to do this one reasonably, we get to about 110, we pull up, kick the rudder as hard as possible, counter roll to get our heading back, and there is the airport. And if we're doing an airshow, we will do a fan favourite, and we will buzz the crowd. Now, you may notice that the speedo on this only goes up to 150. That's because the plane goes up to about 155 and then it stops flying. And you might have noticed that I got up to about 135 in that. But a nice low pass that is utterly irresponsible. And then that maneuver from before. Zoom! And hitting the nose down before we stall. And now we're flying along nice and sensibly, about 300 feet off the deck when we were about 50 feet off the deck a moment ago. And of course, now we've got to climb up again. And one thing that is noticeable with this plane is that it likes to stall. Just because it's operating on the margins of performance that will actually keep it in the air. So later warplanes, you get all of this kind of poetic description about how this machine was bred for war, this machine was bred to kill. Now, the Fokker Triplane and all of the planes of its time are part of that breeding program. But this is from before they had bred out the instinct that, well, if the plane wants to kill, its own pilot is a lot closer. So, if this machine wants to kill, it knows it's got much easier access to you than anyone else on the other side. Which is hilarious to me. Like, this thing wants to stall. You can stall it by climbing too hard, but, you know, not that hard. You can stall it by turning too tight. You can stall it by missing the engine controls slightly. So, if I take a normal, gentle navigational sort of turn, you can see it'll hold its altitude. It'll hold at about 75 to 80 knots. A little less if I let the nose climb like that. And, you know, fairly slow turns. You don't do those turns when somebody's trying to get behind you with guns. And again, it'll hold speed, it'll hold altitude, and it will turn kinda slowly. Now, in practical flying, a vertical turn is actually described as anything over 45 degrees of bank. And that's actually kinda legit because these planes, if you bank them that hard and then try to make it turn hard, they won't thank you for it. So, you know, there was our nice gradual turns. Now let's do a tight turn. So, we pull in, we pull up, and we hit the rudder to keep the nose on alignment. And you can see it is dropping altitude or speed or both, but turning really quite sharply. And I can do that in the other direction. At which point they actually describe this as control inversion because the rudder is essentially your elevator at the moment. But again, nice tight turns and really trying to stall. You know, you kick the rudder just on its own and it tries to do you a mischief. And since we're coming in past these guys, we'll give them another buzz. And we'll get the noise going a little bit. Daka, 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 daka. So yes, this thing, one of the things that you will not be able to see because it is just out of sight. Okay, that went badly. See what I mean? I was not respecting this plane as much as I should have been. And of course, what is going on? Yeah, we weren't meant to be litho braking. So that's a first for the channel. And essentially what happened there is that it was constantly locked in a stall at ground level, and I couldn't get the nose down without smashing the... Like, if I'd let go of the stick, I would have just completely smashed the propeller into the ground. But instead, it just would not pick its speed back up. So, there we go. My first crash on stream. Because I was talking and not paying enough attention. So, don't do that one, kids. Grumble, grumble. Didn't enjoy that. Okay. Let's get back into the air. And this is, of course, a lot less formal than the We Are Flying Sensibly streams, because we are doing aerobatics and not flying sensibly. But yeah, that was just a genuine loss of control there. I got caught in a ground stall and couldn't see in front of me well enough to know if I could just cut the engine and try to stop, because, you know, I kept having to pull up over the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and only just getting clear of them until the one that I didn't. So again, watching that gyroscopic precession and watching that I don't counter it too hard, and then it actually pulls up. That's more like it. So essentially what happened was I got stuck with the pitch at maximum, and it was just enough to keep it kind of skimming. And if I dropped it at all, it would have dropped the nose straight into the ground. And this is the other reason that we don't take Wing Commander Lamington with us on this plane, because got to keep him safe. Now, I was in the middle of a rant. Ah yes, the other little interesting fact that I was going to share. There is a manoeuvre that is popularly known called a barrel roll. And you might think I've already done one, because some people will see a plane that does this I describe that as a barrel roll. That is not. That is an aileron roll, or possibly a snap roll or a quick roll. That is not a barrel roll. A barrel roll is much more barrel-shaped. So, this one I will need a decent amount more altitude. So in a barrel roll, which is actually a combat maneuver in modern planes and kind of useful, or in, well, when I say modern, like World War II, and is somewhat useful in this plane, because it is essentially doing a loop and a full turn, like a full roll as well, at the same time. And you draw a path that looks kind of like a barrel. So, I'm actually slightly stressed out from that crash. It's wild. Just getting some altitude back and making sure to stay relatively near the airport. So, a barrel roll of an actual barrel roll. And for this one, we turn the smoke generators on. This plane has aerobatic smoke generators. So we get our maneuver speed, we pull up, and we roll. And we're 90 degrees off, we're sideways, we're facing back the correct direction again. And if we look back, you can see that it is a sideways loop as well as an uppy-downy loop. So, again, with the smoke generators on, we get some speed. And we go up. Sideways. And we're pointing sideways to where we came up. And that one did not go quite so well. We did not get the full back to where we were pointing because it tried to stall a little. And you can see the absolutely pathetic little, not quite a barrel roll shape there. So the barrel roll is slightly easier in this plane than a full loop because you're doing some of the moving with rolling instead of just up and down. But it's still not the easiest maneuver, which is why it's so popular in aerobatics. And the combat use of a barrel roll is if somebody is turning and you want to get behind them, it makes you turn tighter but takes slightly longer to do it. So you can get in behind them. If you turned that tight but didn't take more time to do it, then you'd end up in front of them. And if you took that amount of time for the turn but didn't end up doing it that tight, you'd end up overshooting them. So it is used, like most of the aerobatic maneuvers that come from combat are, how do I turn quickly and in the least amount of space, or in the right amount of space and time, such that I am behind somebody instead of in front of them. The modern Immelman is for, I am flying under somebody and I would like to be behind them instead. The World War I Immelman is, I have just flown past somebody and I would like to fly past them again so that I can shoot them more. The Split S is somebody is behind me and I would like them not to be. And the barrel roll is somebody is turning and I would like to turn more than them but be behind. And the reason that behind is most important is you might have noticed that the guns point forwards. The planes where the guns do not point forwards have a different approach to things. But if the guns point forwards, that's where you put the thing you want to shoot. And I am, as has been previously noted, not a combat pilot. And I think we've seen why. So, smoke generators on. Dive, and we are lined up with runway 36. We get our 110 knots. We pull up, and we roll. And we are stalling slightly. There we go. That was more like a barrel roll. As you can see, this lovely, it is somewhat circular from both the side and from the front, because we have gone around. Now this thing did a rather tight turn at the top there because it was basically stopped. That is the nature of these sorts of planes. And then there is one last manoeuvre. Unless there are requests of things to attempt and or demonstrate, there is just the last couple of bits for once you want to go downwards again, which to demonstrate going downwards I will need to demonstrate going upwards a bit first. But yes, if there are any requests about either topics or manoeuvres, what's my favourite manoeuvre to do? Well, now that I've got it working, the World War I Immelmann wingover is quite good. Otherwise, I do rather like the split S, where you just stop the engine, try to slow down a little bit, and then just roll over and pull up until you're facing the other way. It's just a very sarcastic manoeuvre to me, of just, no, I'm going this way, and backwards and down a bit. Yes. So, a couple of interesting facts with the Fokker triplane. 320 of these were built during the war, which seems like a lot, but this thing mostly stayed in the almost prototype phase because of some failures with the top wing. Basically, the top wing of this makes 2.5 times the amount of lift that the bottom wing does, which is not good for the structure. That's actually part of what these braces are for. But, you know, you'd get them just breaking the wing, and now you're not flying anymore. Of the 320 that were built, between the war and the post-war armistice, 3 survived. One of them was being used for stunt and I think even filming work and crashed in the 1930s. And the other 2 were stored nice and safely in German museums because, you know, these were a bit of a point of pride. Unfortunately, those German museums were in German cities, and this Austrian painter made a bit of a mess. So the only 2 surviving in museums after that, the third one crashed in the 30s, those other 2 those museums both got bombed. So the only intact Fokker triplanes are modern replicas, or, you know, replicas of all sorts of ages, and there are miscellaneous artifacts. And that's it. None of these managed to survive both the war they were in and the war that came next. Okay, so do the wing over and the split S, which is the sarcastic one. Yep. So, let's find our alignment. And the thing with finding the alignment for the Immelmann turn and the split S is that if I was doing these in a combat sense, I wouldn't actually care about my alignment to the ground, I would care about my alignment to the other planes. But as it's just me up here, okay, so a little bit in from runway 09, so we get our speed, 100, 110 knots is good. And then we get our uppies. And then we go off to the side. and that is essentially a stall-based maneuver, but you use the stall to make you go the least amount forwards while you're trying to turn. That's how you make a turn tighter. You go forwards less while you turn, which is why the Immelman turn, where you pull up, basically stall, but start the turn bit before you lose control, and then let the plane dive out and get back to where it was. That just puts, so, you know, you're going up instead of forward, so that cuts a lot of your turn, and then you're going less up, less forward, which is now up, which slows you down even more, and then you just kick the tail over, and you're facing the other direction. And then we've got the split S, which you can cut the engines, but we're cruising along at, what, 80 knots, about, let's get up to 4,000 feet before we start this. Let's just do this as a 4,000-ish fleet, about 80 knots, and I'm going... Oh no! Germans! And now I'm facing them. And the good thing about doing the high-speed one is that you don't actually lose that much altitude if you do it well, because you pick up speed, and then you're just doing that to get back up again and slow you down a little. That one I lost a bit more than I was planning, because the rudder got caught while I was doing that, and it got a little bit weird, which, you know, happens when you are not an expert pilot trying to do combat maneuvers. But the last... let me just check my notes if I had anything else I wanted to show off. No. That is the maneuvers I wanted to show, other than these last two. So, one is a potential combat maneuver, but very risky, and often just used for aerobatic purposes. So I will put the smoke on again, and it is called the tail slide. So, we cut the engine, and we pull up. And then we drop the nose, hit the engine again, and get control back. And now that might seem a bit of a weird maneuver, bit of a silly thing to do. But if we look at the smoke trail, which is great for just working out what's going on, you can see that I kind of just stopped for a bit there. And the whole fun of a well-executed tail slide, which I'm not going to claim that as being perfectly well executed, but the fun of it is that if somebody is directly behind you and too close, you pull up and stop and let them kind of try to just go under you, because their options are under you or into you, and they don't want to die. And then you drop the nose, and if you're lucky, you're behind them. Now, I describe that as kind of a risky maneuver. It's risky enough that you don't usually see it done until modern jets, where it's called a Cobra, because those can just stand on their tail and go for it. But, so the thing about doing that in a World War I dogfight is that if they're not quite as close as you thought they were, you've just literally stopped in midair. Stationary targets are easy to hit, and you've just done it in front of somebody who was trying to shoot you anyway. So, the tail slide is not usually seen as a combat maneuver, despite the hilarity if one works in that context. But it is a great airshow maneuver, because you pull up and you stop. And it leads nicely into the a maneuver called the falling leaf. So the problem with these sorts of planes is they have very low. On a modern plane, this would be, you've got your V speeds, like, you know, V1, V2, rotate, that sort of thing. I keep using VX and VY for my things. There is also VNE, velocity never exceed. That is the structural damage speed. These planes have a low VNE. A low, if you hit this speed, something important will fall off. On this plane, it's about 155 knots. Now, we're about 4,600 feet, climbing towards like 5,000. And Temora Airport down there is at 907. But what if we want to, like, be more like down there instead of up here? Let's say we've decided we're tired of flying. Or, you know, let's say that at 1,500 feet, there's one of our friends who might need some assistance. You can't just dive this plane down there. Like, okay, so we're at 4,800 feet. This plane is notably good for diving. If I try and really dive... Okay, that got us to 140 something, and only cut about 1,000 feet. So we can, you know, cut the engine and circle down slowly, but, you know, one of our friends is down there and they need help. So instead of that, I'm just going to get us to about 5,000 feet to properly demonstrate this. And we'll be heading a little bit away from the airport so we can do the maneuver heading back towards it and you know, then the thing after the falling leaf I think will be landing. I think this is about enough of me ranting about World War I planes and physics and maneuvers that you can't do. And also because this thing has no manual controls and no automatic controls, and it like the controls are directly wired, not even with pulleys in the way. Basically, it is kind of exhausting to fly. Like, the full fuel tank endurance of this is about an hour and a half, and I don't think you'd want it to be that much more. Also, you may notice that 1,000 feet of climb that the Red Baron described as being like a monkey is not still there once we're up at 5,000-ish feet. Some planes of this era would take up to half an hour to reach 10,000 feet. Just to put that, it's probably about 12 minutes in this if you're concentrating and controlling the engine well. But still, a 747 will do that in 2 minutes. But the falling leaf descent. Now, it's called a falling leaf because you take that tail slide maneuver, but that thing where I kicked the engine back in and pulled up out of it, well, instead of getting the engine going and pulling out of it with almost no altitude loss if you control it well, we want this to get us down to the ground quickly. So, here we are at 5,100 feet, and that timer says about 20 seconds, so we cut the engine, we get to that stall point, and we hold it at that stall point, and we fall off to one side, and we start to dive, and then we pull back up again, and we stall, and we ride that stall, and we start. And you can see as the plane wants to tip left and right while plummeting from the sky like this. Oh, no, don't pull the engine back on that much. There we go. And as it tries to tip itself like that, and we just ride the stall. This is actually one of the better ones I've done of this. So I am fully back on the joystick at the moment, by the way. And we are barely moving forward at all. And the way that it wants to tip, but you can't actually use the ailerons to control it during this. Oh, that engine doesn't want to cut, does it? And that was in fact not me powering the engine back on. There we go. But, so there's 3,000 feet cut without hitting the overspeed. So that was not quite the good falling leaf. That was combining in a couple of different maneuvers, like a more stable version of the tail slide, but lets you cut the altitude quite nicely. Because if you want to be able to get the plane down, you need to not overspeed the wings. And we're at, what, 1,800 feet now, so our friend that was having trouble, we swoop in, we go ducka ducka ducka, and then we swoop out again. Now, we'll be landing on that grass strip again, instead of a house. So, we will get some distance out. And, you'll see the last interesting bit of control advice from practical flying that I'm going to be sharing. Which is, yeah, throttle control on a landing approach. Which, now, some of this may be difficulty of translation between modern and century-old terminology. It may be that when they say cut the engine, and a modern eye reads that as shut off the engine, they may mean just pull back to idle. But they specifically talk about having to restart the engine for a missed approach. So, at about 100 feet above the landing strip, you cut the engine. I may have done that a little far out. Yep. So we uncut the engine, carry it forward a little more, and then we can cut. But basically, with all of that ridiculous rotational force from the... Well, that was twice. So, don't do aerobatics and distractedly stream, kids. So what happened there is that I cut the engine a little too high, despite it being at about the altitude that is recommended, and I stalled. I stalled about 10 feet from the ground, which meant that the plane dropped, and the big heavy engine dropped more. That's the sort of crash that 50-50 survivable. If your seatbelt's good and the top wing doesn't collapse down on top of you, probably survive. Might catch fire. Might get crushed. So this has been a bit of a break from the usual sensible flying that I've been doing. Some info dumping about World War I planes, some info dumping about doing cool paint jobs, some ridiculous flying, and some crashing. I think the game itself has basically declared that to be where we end the stream, and aren't you glad that you're Airshow patrons and not passengers for this one? So, unless there are any last questions, I will sign off there and let everybody go about their day thinking about how bad an aerobatics pilot I am, or possibly just how reckless an aerobatics pilot I am, and how much I should not be flying century-old aircraft that close to the ground. Of course, the second crash was when I was meaning to be close to the ground, just not quite that rapidly, but still. Fly safe. Fly like me when I'm in other planes, not in this plane. And goodbye.